How many times do we talk about the whole child? And taking care of the whole child is what equates to success inside the walls of school. But how many times do we stand behind those standardized tests with their scores that cause anxiety and coldly measure what's considered student success? Hey, everyone. Dr. Jones here with another episode of Seeing to Lead, the podcast designed to help leaders solve their everyday problems. And this week, I talked to Erich Bolz. Erich is the Vice President of Research and District Engagement for the Center for Educational Effectiveness. During this discussion, he provides us so much information about whole student outcomes. He starts by defining what is meant by whole student because we often talk about it, but carry different viewpoints on it. One of the important things is that Erich talks about 4 points of success. Now imagine if we could all agree that these 4 points indicated how successful a student could be and then proactively went after improving them. Those 4 points: the students enjoy school, they have friends, did they have at least one adult that they felt cared about them, and did they have agency, a hopefulness for moving forward in their lives. Wouldn't that change how we look at schools? Wouldn't that encourage schools to be proactive instead of reactive when it comes to serving their communities? And that's only a small portion of the community-based divergent thinking that Erich provides us information and strategies for. You are going to love the information in this episode. I guarantee it. Once you're done, do me a favor, take the time right away to subscribe and leave a rating and review. I'd be much appreciative because it helps the show more than many people realize. And then share it with your biggest takeaway on social media. But enough hearing from me. Let's hear from Erich on community-focused, collaborative, proactive education that helps our students succeed on Seeing to Lead.
Ostensibly with changing the achievement trajectories of students, but the reality is we're tasked with solving just about every societal ill thanks to federal and state policy. And I'm passionate about that work. I don't believe that education is an equalizer. I don't believe in leveling the playing field, but I do believe that education is every single individual's best chance at having a life different than maybe the life they envision for themselves.
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better.
Erich Bolz is currently the Vice President of Research and District Engagement for the Center for Educational Effectiveness. His educational career spans over 25 years in public education as a remedial reading teacher, pre-K to K-12 principal, central office administrator in small, large, and educational service district levels, an adjunct professor at Heritage University, board member at Communities in Schools of Benton-Franklin, Washington, and Partners for Early Learning serving Tri-Cities, Washington. Erich has a history of leading educational transformation. Specifically, and there's a number of these, implementing building and district MTSS systems, informing and executing strategic planning, facilitating process improvement discussions using compression planning methodology, authoring and publishing on systemic change in education, writing effective grant proposals, directing special education at a regional level for an educational service district, and TEDx, keynote, and conference breakout speaking at a local national level on MTSS, education, literacy, the importance of early learning, educator care, and community building. What a list. And anytime I have a guest on that has done this much work in not just transforming education, but supporting everyone involved in the process, I get excited. Erich's one of those guests who has not just accomplished transformation, but done it from a ground level, hands-on approach. So Erich, welcome to Seeing to Lead.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I appreciate that. And that was a really generous introduction. As we were talking pre-show, it either looks like an accomplished biography or I'm incredibly old. So I tend to think it may have a lot to do with the latter. I'm excited to be here and engage in a conversation today.
Yeah, hey, don't just take the pat on the back. I was once told by a very wise person, his name's Danny Bauer, that when somebody compliments you, just say thank you. Because it does sometimes get a little uncomfortable as we get to moving on and we have these accomplishments that people highlight for us.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Danny Bauer. When I moved from public education to the Center for Educational Effectiveness, I got connected with Danny pretty early, and he's just provided invaluable counsel at no charge. So it's that the world is a small place.
Yeah. And he's a fantastic person. But you've got this list, and there are a ton of things listed there. You've been in different positions. Clearly, one of the things you're passionate about is transforming education. But with all those, what are you really passionate about? What's really got you going? And how does that play out in your current role as vice president?
Well, I think those of us who are ultimately called to education, and I fought against it. I'm a child of two educators, so it was the last thing I was ever going to do. And then a quarter century goes by, right? I think the word's really all about impact. And I think the longer you're in education, the more you recognize that we work in a triage model. It's really triage by bad public policy, in my opinion. And we're tasked with ostensibly with changing the achievement trajectories of students. But the reality is we're tasked with solving just about every societal ill thanks to federal and state policy. And I'm passionate about that work. I don't believe that education is an equalizer. I don't believe in leveling the playing field, but I do believe that education is every single individual's best chance at having a life different than maybe the life they envision for themselves.
It's interesting that makes so much sense that your passion, when you describe your passion that way. Two things come to mind when reading about you, looking at your things and hearing you talk is community and change. And when you talk about education, how it's a person's best chance to do better, well, that involves the whole community because a person that does well improves their community. So let's talk a little bit about community building. How do we go about getting everybody on board with that same vision?
Gosh, I just had visions of Jamie Vollmer flash in front of my eyes when you mentioned that. I love his work on, schools basically can't do it alone. And if you've ever had the chance to hear him speak, he really initially got involved in, looking under the hood at public schools from a critical standpoint and as a business person. And then the more he looked, the more he realized, my gosh, these guys are tasked with everything under the sun. And they can't possibly, especially when you think about the odd conveyor belt that's public education, the most impactful years are birth to 5, birth to 3 inside of birth to 5. And then, a school system that is passive just receives students in kindergarten when the goose is already cooked, proverbially in terms of brain development. And then we dump all kinds of resources into remediation. And we wonder why this approach hasn't worked very well. So it really is about educating the community, involving the community, marshaling community resources, working across disciplines to make sure that every kid has the best chance they have in each of the communities they live in well prior to coming to school if we're going to make a difference. And I truly believe that schools can't do it alone. It has to be about these community partnerships.
And so does that fall on the schools? I know schools can't do it alone. And one of the things that I work really hard to do is communicate a lot. Communicate, how people get involved. But now I'm at the high school level. And I know people communicate K through 12, different leaders at different levels. But does it put more pressure on the schools that we need to communicate more? Because we do communicate a lot, but we still don't get that increased amount of engagement. And I know that I receive less by nature of the beast because parents are super involved at the elementary level and it dies off because the kids are going to be fine, right, as they get up to high school. But is that a shortcoming on schools' part or something that they have to focus on more to get people engaged? How do we cross that engagement gap?
I think when you look at the social sector, this whole notion of collective impact is really in the United States is really truly a no man's land, right? So we function in our silos in education and we function in our silos in medicine and we function in our silos as the corporate community. And there really isn't an agency or policy push for the collective impact that we know we need to engender and maintain if we're going to truly make the difference for each of the children that we serve. So yes, I do believe, unfortunately, the onus is on schools. I think particularly small and under-resourced school systems don't have people that have the luxury or context to work in that work. And I think it puts schools in a really uncomfortable proposition relative to, you can choose not to do the work. You can say, we're just going to be the best little K-12 system we can be. But then you're dealing with variables that are really within the span of your influence and choosing to sort of abdicate that influence. So it's sort of a Sophie's choice. You can maybe do a little bit less inside of K-12 and earmark some resources for this community partnership, this collective impact that we seek to maintain. Or you can kind of just live with what you get if you choose to not play a role, or you're not resourced in a way where you can really feasibly play a leadership role in generating those community partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to think the idea of just getting what you get. That just runs so contrary to how I think or what I believe. Just the idea that you're going to accept what you're handed and that's it. You're not going to go out and try and get any additional. It almost comes down to like a cultural or a culture type of belief or a culture that you're trying to create, that culture of collaboration. Do you have any specific ideas or ways that schools can create that? Because it really is a mindset. I mean, once you get into the work's a little, I find the work's sometimes difficult, but the most difficult step is getting people to buy into the mindset.
I couldn't agree more. And I think if you cut to the quick, it's really about student outcomes. It's about whole student outcomes. We've been shackled by very narrow outcomes in the context of No Child Left Behind and everything that's followed, I think, over about the last 25 years. So when we think about, if we think about the end in mind, which is the healthy student who matriculates outside of the school system and contributes to the community, I think it comes really down to four things. On the student side, they probably have enjoyed coming to school on some level. They identify that they have a group of friends, probably had a group of friends all the way through school. They have an adult, at least one adult in the school system that they believe cares for them, is an advocate for them. And then ultimately they've got some sort of agency or hopefulness moving forward. When we think about that kid who has agency and hopefulness, who has friends, who has adults that care about them, and they're engaged and enjoy coming to school, we can't really hurt that kid institutionally. So it really becomes, to me, about, if we look at student achievement, our kids who achieve on high stakes standardized tests are generally kids that hit at least 3 or 4 of those buckets I talked about. So then it becomes a proposition of, well, how do we create conditions that lead to more kids coming with those skills, as opposed to feeling like we've just got to build those skills into every single kid who may come with a deficit. And again, I think that leads down the road to community partnership, birth to 5, if not prenatal to 5. And when you begin with the end in mind, I think it fosters a very different mindset in terms of what is our role in creating healthy citizens? Or are we just disposed to make sure that you can read a little bit on your way out the door?
Right. And you talk about those 4 points that you mentioned of student success, or what helps a student be successful when you're talking about any type of, when you're looking at the metrics that we typically use in schools. But something I want to go back to and just kind of sit with for a little while is the whole student outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you mean by whole student? We say that often and different people use it different ways. But I find the idea of whole student fascinating.
You hit on one of my very favorite topics. We have 100 different words, phrases, or concepts that we mention education, and 100 educators have their own view of practice. So we're amazing private practitioners in that regard. So, when I think of a whole child, I think of a child who's well regulated. I think of a child who has a sense of agency and is socially connected. And what's interesting about that is when you think about sort of big corporate influence on education, we saw a lot of what happened under No Child Left Behind as we saw corporate interests saying, you've got to have better mathematicians and better readers on the way out the door. What businesses are saying today, and they've been saying it for a while, is, we don't actually care about that stuff all that much. We'd like to have well-regulated kids who can, or young career professionals who can get along with each other, who can kind of figure stuff out on their own with limited information, who are nimble, who have agency, who understand how to navigate the world socially. And if you guys could get us those type of workers, we can teach them the content. So I think it's been a real flip. But when I talk about whole child, I talk about a child who's regulated, who's got some agency and knows how to get along and navigate multiple contexts.
I'm so glad that you said that about that flip. And we need kids with these math skills, this knowledge, we need people that can problem solve. They're self-starters. They're motivated. They work together well. We started innovation career pathways at my school, and that has to do with giving kids professional certifications before they leave high school to make them more marketable, to go into the workforce. It's a type of vocational programming that college prep schools are doing now. And it's funded through the state. But I work with these businesses, and in talking to them, it's so true. They said, look, here you can do these certifications and everything. Can you teach them this? Can you teach them how to talk to people? Can you teach them how to get along in teams and collaboratively solve problems that come up? So I'm so glad you brought that up as a point.
Well, and it's funny how the world is changing, and we could go down the AI rabbit hole, and that could be probably a whole other show. But I got a call just to underscore this point, I got a call from a colleague the other day who was wanting to know some information around confidence interval and margin of error. And I was like, gosh, I could probably crank out the calculations and run it by a mentor and make sure I did the math right. But I took the basic information down. I was literally on another call, and I just punched it into ChatGPT-4, and it kicks out every possible permutation of, what that statistical algorithm would ever purport to help with. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, as a former ELA teacher, I thought, well, the world has been turned upside down by AI. I think in terms of mathematics, it may be more turned upside down. I mean, who cares if you can calculate confidence interval? You know what it means. Are you creating the right inputs in the context of the query? Because if you have that street sense, the tools that we have do so much more for us now. So I think this notion of you've got to have basic academic skills, maybe at the expense of these other kind of whole human skills, is becoming progressively more antiquated quicker than we even have any idea.
Absolutely. And it's, that's always going to be a fight. It's interesting when we talk about AI and let's just say, for the sake of argument, the advent of AI over the past year and a half, 2 years. AI has been with us a lot longer than that. And we've all used it to some degree, but people it's slight, it's small. So people didn't really pay that much attention to it. And now we're dealing with something much larger in education where really the humanistic skills are more important that students come out of schools with. And especially like you were talking, regulated, emotionally regulated. If students can do that and problem solve and figure things out and interact with each other, then those are the skills they need to be successful.
Well, for sure. And I think this technology also is kind of a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because the more we're engaged in the technology, the more isolated we are. It's a fact. I mean, everybody's reading the English generation right now. So it becomes doubly daunting if we don't double down on these skills that were, I think, a lot more native to folks of earlier generations, in part because of a lack of access to that technology. I mean, it impacts everything from attachment parenting to it's just much easier for me to interact with my phone as a 12-year-old and not put myself out there. So it's a really, really interesting sort of brave new world that we are living in and navigating. Technology does so much for us, but I think it's also limiting and isolating in terms of our human-to-human interactions.
Which, before you were saying how we're so siloed in the private practice of education, this just exacerbates that problem if we allow it to.
Oh my gosh, we can have 330 million people across the United States working or living from home. I mean, we're still not back to where we were from the COVID pandemic. And I think the ability to go to the office every once in a while at least reinforces the fact that, there's some pretty incredible things that happen when humans interact with each other in real time.
Absolutely. And it's funny. So you talked about that, and not funny like haha, but as I'm thinking about this, when you talk about how we're missing the boat early on, and so then it becomes a game of remediation. And it would be great if we could be proactive instead of reactive, but there's that bump. And now you being involved in education, you know that anytime you change a program, schedule, classes, there's that bump that you have to get over where it's messed up for a year. There's a really big bump that education's got to get over if they're going to go from reactive to proactive. What is it? And now you've given talks, you've studied, you've coached people on MTSS and RTI. Those models are that type of thinking. Where do those fit into the idea of proactive versus reactive and maybe helping with that bump?
Well, I think they completely fit in on the proactive side. I think there's some real fatal flaws, and I think it matters what framework you pick up when you're implementing MTSS or RTI. They almost always go right to the structural. And I think as school leaders and school system leaders, we tend to go to the structural when we can't figure anything else out, right? Okay, our reading scores are down. Let's facilitate an adoption, bring in a whole new set of instructional materials, and we'll train everybody up on all these skills they need to deliver now that we're back to looking at reading as a scientific process. Hopefully that'll stay around for a while, but I digress there. I've lost my train of thought here a little bit, actually. MTSS. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I hope that piece stays in the podcast. He lost his train of thought right in the middle of that. I think we default to the structure and we don't look at the cultural. And that's where we do so much of our work. As a school leader, if your staff doesn't have high regard for one another or interest in you, it doesn't matter what you implement. You can bring in all the best practices, the most evidence-based practices in the world, and you can't implement anything. We see this in the sporting world, and I loathe to use sports analogies, but they resonate because they're pretty simple, right? Back in the day, the Brooklyn Nets tried to put a super team together with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden. They said they didn't need a coach. 3 Hall of Fame basketball players out of 5 positions on the court, and they couldn't ever string 2 wins together in a row. So maybe they did need a coach, but there was something in the culture, regardless of all of the skills they had, the structural skills they had that kept them from winning. And I think we completely missed that boat in schools. When you talk to these implementation gurus around MTSS or RTI, it's always about the structure. Do you have the universal screening stuff in place? How do your teams meeting work? Where are your cut scores? Do you have a protocol for implementing interventions? What does your problem solving model look like? Well, how well do the people play together in the schoolhouse? Do they trust each other? Do they wholeheartedly believe that they can pull this off? And if we don't do that work first, we just continue to spin our wheels, which is what we see in the context of implementation. Anybody who studied a little bit of implementation science, most multi-year implementations in school systems fail inside of 7 months, and we blame the presenter, the curriculum, we blame the vehicle without looking at what's actually going on underneath the car. So I'm pretty passionate about, can you quantify culture? And as a school leader, as the keeper of that culture, how much of the discipline of your daily work is really in fostering, if not engendering, a better culture?
Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community take center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, you don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. seeingtolead.com.
You have said so much right there, the idea of quantifying culture, and the school leader, how much of their day quantifiably is spent trying to create a more positive culture or foster one or, keep one growing, whatever you want to call it. There are different culture surveys out there that I've seen, but like you said, okay, you read a culture survey, you take it, and then it's what you do with it. But the idea of a staff needing to trust, because that's what it basically comes down to, is how much they trust and believe in the leader. When you lose that idea of you need to be coached because everybody needs to be coached, that's when you run into some issues. And I think oftentimes in schools, we do run into that from leaders saying, I've got this figured out. I know how to do this, so I'll get it done. And then we start to fall short. So in that vein, we've talked about the importance of community, the importance of the leader with culture. We've talked about different structures and how we have to worry about culture instead of structures. You walk into a school, I'd love to say the perfect school, but there's no such thing. You walk into a school and things are working really, really well with a proactive feel. They've got their structures in place, but more importantly, they've got their culture in place. What does that look like?
First of all, this was such a great question. So in doing some MTSSB support for a couple of schools around the locale where I live, I sort of framed up exactly that same question. I said, so I live in a relatively large metro area in the middle of nowhere. There's about 350,000 people here, about 50,000 students across 3 fairly large school systems, a handful of smaller ones. So I was like, my gosh, with 40 some elementary schools within 9 miles of my house, there's got to be a school or 2 or 3 out there that really are functioning well. So I found that school. I spent a couple hours at the school. It was an elementary school. It felt like elementary school about 2000, 2005, and that people were just doing their jobs. You weren't seeing defiance, kids eloping, calming rooms, kind of all the things that we see going on in just about every garden variety school. And I got to sit in on their problem solving processes and watch this support team made up of counselors, social workers, principal, vice principal, kind of the whole gamut, really processing through the work well. And I was struck by all of their amazing structures and how proactive they were. They don't assign kids to detention. They assign kids to academies where they're either getting CBT or they're picking up skills on how to not bop somebody in the head on the playground. So I was just impressed with all the proactivity. So I asked this question. I said, I've been here for 90 minutes. You can't fake it. Like the principal said in this meeting, wasn't interrupted one time. Vice principal not interrupted one time. Super calm feel. You can't hear anybody screaming out in the hallways. It's just like the trains are just running on time here. And so one of the 2 counselors said it best. She said, it works here because I've never been on a higher functioning team, which I think just takes us back full circle. What they put in order first was, they were vulnerable. They said, we realized we had a problem. We let the staff know we don't have the answers, but we too, like you, agree that the behaviors that we're seeing in our students isn't acceptable and can't continue. We've got to find a way to fix it. And then they really fix themselves from the inside with this incredibly trusting culture. And so you can implement any vehicle. You can throw that team now any curveball because they truly trust and believe in each other. And results, I think, only reinforce those beliefs, strengthen those beliefs.
It's fantastic. And I love how it highlights the importance of a team. Many times we talk about teams that we're part of or leadership teams where people are afraid to speak their mind because they're afraid of what's going to happen. And there's that lack of trust. One of the things that I love about one of the teams I'm on is we have no qualms in professionally arguing with each other, where if we don't agree with each other, we have no problem saying that. And we can go back and forth in the meeting, but people are heard. We get better perspectives that way. And then we move forward with a decision that everybody understands and that's more solid.
Gosh, I totally appreciate what you said there. And I think we espouse that we really value divergent thinking, but most teams don't. So I think 2 things. Young administrators make huge mistakes by trying to be the heroic leader. Like I'm basically the waiter at your table and I'm going to fulfill every request. And the way I'm going to build constituency confidence in my leadership is you throw a problem at me and I'll solve it. Well, that becomes completely unsustainable inside of a school of any size. So it's there are some short-term gains I think young administrators make with that heroic approach, but only long-term pain. And then the other side of that is, we do function best as teams, and we function best as teams that think first divergently and next convergently. But most teams only think convergently. They are trying to guess at what the leader wants because the leader hasn't created a safe environment for processing. And so I think what I would say is, what I can see inside of a schoolhouse is stop being heroic as a leader. You can only be a hero for so long and then you burn out. And where are people? Truly value divergent thinkers, get people who process the world differently than you do on your team, and then go convergent. So you've got to come to consensus, but we got to value divergence first. And I think those things aren't inherently taught to leaders, and they're so critical in building high functioning organizations.
So true. And it's such an important thing that we do talk about divergent thinking and what we call a perspective taking or whatever phraseology you want to put to it. But the fact is we don't do it wholesale, as it were. So
because we fear the repercussions generally.
Yeah.
We've all been on those teams.
Oh, yes, we have been on those teams. So I do want to, your vice president, if we can just take a quick turn, your vice president Center for Educational Effectiveness. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about your center. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the center, the kind of work you're involved in and what you're doing and how you're impacting education?
Well, I'll sort of tell you my origin story on how I got there, because I think it illustrates the work that the Center for Educational Effectiveness does. We go affectionately by CEE, only well known out here in the Pacific Northwest, but should be better known other places. So when I went to my last stop, I was assistant superintendent in a fairly large school system by Washington state standards, other than Seattle Metro. People who know the Pacific Northwest, we're pretty rural out here. And so about 20,000 students, 25 buildings. Interesting people who also don't know a lot about the eastern side of the state of Washington. We look a lot like the San Joaquin Valley out here, both in terms of what we produce agriculturally and what we look like demographically. So the school district I worked in was 75% free reduced eligible, 75% Latino, huge agricultural community. And we had, in 1819 was the last normal year before COVID, we had 7 schools that were named as high progress schools by the State Board of Education in the state of Washington, which Washington's divided up into educational service regions. We had more schools in Pasco School District than in the educational service district region combined, getting that honor. And I, among other things, you talk about other duties as assigned, that could be a whole other podcast. But among other things, I oversaw the secondary supervisor and directly oversaw the 16 elementary schools. So a number of the schools that were named as high progress schools, I apologize, it's a little long-winded, but there's a good point here. I was like, well, gosh, I want to reflect on what is it we're doing. So I said, you have excellent leadership in all 7 of these buildings. They're processing these CE surveys, small snippets of the data, using a school transformation model out of Gonzaga University. It's a little school with a basketball program out here in Spokane, Washington. But so basically snippets of the CE data, iterative PDSA cycles, and high trust among staff. And I was like, it's these 4 things. So I called the Center for Educational Effectiveness and said, I've had no idea how to use your surveys. And I thought I was pretty good at helping schools really transform and see better results, whether that be attendance, course completion, academic achievement. But I said, it's these 4 things working in concert that have really made the difference for our district. And it's been nice to kind of be able to put that, thinking stream together. And they said, do you want a job? So the opportunity to not be the complaint department at the end of the day is in a large district as an assistant superintendent and just work on positive impact resonated with me right away. So it's a happy story for Colin as a satisfied consumer, explaining the benefit of the perceptual data. And then, life takes a pretty cool right turn.
That's a great story. That's an excellent story. And I liked what you said about, having a positive impact, being able to have that opportunity to where you can see the positive and work on the positive and spread the positive instead of having to absorb the negative before trying to do that.
Well, and I feel like I finally got to a point where there are about 4 or 5 things that have to coalesce inside of a schoolhouse in order for that school to start to transform and transcend where its demographic might suggest it performs, which is another thing we do at the Center for Educational Effectiveness through a really cool study of positive outlier schools in Washington State. I think only the second study of its kind in the country. But I think being able to work with schools so they focus on the right things is just something that is so missing. And it's nice to be in an organization that provides sort of that support, that missing link, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, you think of, and I know at least in Massachusetts, when a school district or school is severely underperforming, the state steps in and they put somebody in charge and they take over and they make sure that, darn it, they're going to turn that school around, which very rarely ever occurs. Not that I have any strong feelings about that.
Gosh, I thought Washington was unique.
Yeah, no. Oh, no. And, boy, if there was a way to be able to provide these materials, which you folks are working on, and this information and provide almost like a guide or a mentorship or a coaching to help these schools improve based on scientific information, things that have been tested in the field and are known to work. And if there was fidelity of implementation, but what an impact. You want to talk about an impact, a positive impact on education. What an impact that would be.
Well, and I think that's exactly the work we do. And on our website, if you go to the research tab, you can find kind of all the shortcut documents. So I think the information out there, it was incredibly well quantified in the data. And then doing the qualitative piece of, well, wow, Chris, your school's pretty exceptional. Why are you getting the results you're getting? We heard the same handful of things over and over again. I think the big issue, and you hit on it through this, and it's policy driven, right? It's bad federal policy that rolls down through the states. We have this punitive model. Then, the state has no choice if they take Title I funds, which all states do, to then deliver the stick to the buildings that, my goodness, if the stick would have worked, they would have figured it out already. They're in the bottom 5% of their state.
Right.
So it requires you to work differently. It requires you to work on very, very different things. It requires you to work first on culture. Generally, there's some sort of catalytic event in these schools. fully a third of the schools that we studied in the state of Washington had started in, so the happy ending to your story, which almost never occurs in Washington or Massachusetts, fully a third of these schools were in the lowest tier of school improvement designation at one time or another. And it was this collective community response to, well, this isn't who we want to be. This is not the experience we want to be providing as a community, a wider community than the school for our children. And then what are the things that we have to do? Well, as it turns out, you've got to have an experienced, stable leader who's trusted by the staff. Staff have to have trust in each other. Parents and community members have to be authentically seen as value to the school, as opposed to, what can the business community and parents do for us? It's really almost flipping that script completely to, what can we do to better engage them? So it's just a handful of things. And what it doesn't come down to? It doesn't come down to how good are your MTSS protocols. It doesn't come down to, did you adopt the best ever evidence-based, scientifically researched reading curriculum? It comes down to, how are you pulling those levers that impact the human side of this? And are you caring for the whole child? We know, for example, that you get an 11% bump in achievement if you're changing students' ability to regulate themselves. No reading curriculum, GLAD training, or MTSS model brings that about. It's a whole different approach. So you have to be almost an insurgent, I guess, a counter-revolutionary, and be willing to try something completely different, which is why I think fully a third of these schools were ultimately identified in our study to basically say, we're bucking federal policy. We're going to divert those federal funds that come with the external facilitator to try another approach. And we believe that the genius is inside of our community and can be harnessed. That's the approach in a nutshell that makes a difference. You won't see a lot written about it. You won't find it at the What Works Clearinghouse. You won't find it in the Title I regulations or at your state Department of Ed.
I hope everybody was just taking notes on that. You just gave like a little mini class on what needs to be done and why it works. I think that's absolutely fantastic. That, we are getting towards the end of the podcast. And while we do have to, according to you, I think almost do a couple different shows on AI and other duties as assigned.
Hey, when you're scarce for guests, if you can't scare anybody else out.
Without going too far down those rabbit holes, I do have two questions I ask everybody at the end of every podcast. And the first one is and I know you're not face to face in the trenches right now in education per se, but still what you do is educational in nature. If you weren't in education, who, not what would you be?
Well, I think that's a great question. And, as we were talking pre-show, I really fought against going into education. Both of my parents are retired educators. So I said, if there's one thing I'm never going to be, it's going to be a public educator. And so then 25 years pass, and now 5 more in this role. So it is hard for me to conceive of doing something else. Looking back at my notes, I think, and maybe you have to do the hard work first, because these things are still possible, right? I think a travel writer or a novelist, I think I would have done something in the writing profession, maybe been paid even poorer in my career and been a journalist. Those would have been, I think, the attractive options for me.
Oh, there you go. And so what would be the most important piece of advice you'd give to leaders as they work to better support, engage, and empower those they serve?
I think especially to young principals, I would say study organizational development. I mean, it's all out there. Collins, Blanchard, Peter Drucker. When we go to principal prep, at least when I did last century, because I am that old, what I remember is, memorizing 11-digit account codes and having tests on school finance and, some of these other things that then you're 3 days in the profession, you're like, oh, my secretary knows all that stuff already. So really, I think we don't spend enough time indoctrinating folks who are moving into these leadership roles into that. Your job one is to create, curate, support, foster a healthy culture inside of your building. And that's done through very disciplined practices that are all detailed in, all of our great organizational development thinkers, a handful of them I named, a bunch I left off that list, but helping principals understand that if you truly want to transform your environment, you want to be patted on the back by the newspaper for higher achievement scores, being that instructional leader that you learned in principal prep, that's all about capacity building. The job's too fast and it's too complex, especially when you get up the ladders for you to be you're the instructional facilitator. You're helping a community confront its biggest issues. You're changing the culture every day with with disciplined habits of one-on-one questions and making those themes public, putting teams together to solve issues and not being a hero. The advice I would give is study all that stuff that maybe you didn't get out of any of your principal prep program. And I can guarantee you, if you look under the hood inside of the systems or schools near you, around you, that are making a difference. And I'm talking a long haul difference, not like, hey, our achievement scores have been up for the last 2 consecutive years. No flash in the pan stuff. That school that's knocking out of the park, performing better than its demographic would suggest it would, year over year over year, you're going to find these habits deeply ingrained through the entire culture. And it's a bit like finding a needle in a haystack, because like most jobs, I suppose, you learn all the wrong stuff and then you have to put your adaptive hat on and go implement.
So well said. You know, Erich, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast today. You've given us tons to think about. You've given us some resources, some strategies, and some ideas. But most importantly, you've given us a mindset that we need to have moving forward. So really, thank you for all you've said.
Well, hey, Chris, it was a real pleasure being on the show. Thanks for having me. And I truly believe that these things can be seen, felt, quantified, and improved upon. And would love to connect with any of your listeners just to have conversation. I can't tell you how many people have invested in my thinking, growing, and learning for me to get to where I'm at. And I'm always happy to pay that forward.
So that said, what's the best way somebody can get in touch with you if they want to learn more, hear more, or talk to you?
Easiest way to get in touch with me is probably I'm out there on all the old people's social medias. I'm easily found on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, formerly the Twitter. My email address is a great way to reach me. It's Erich. For whatever reason, my parents were honoring our German heritage when I was born in 1968. So that's ERICH @effectiveness.org. And, you know, whether it's through Messenger or through email, I'll get right back and be glad to connect.
That's fantastic. Again, thank you so very much for coming on today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think it added a lot of value to the listeners.
Well, thanks for having me. It was an honor and a pleasure. And I hope that we can host you on our show at some point.
Most definitely.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seen to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrissj@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at Dr. C.S. Jones. If you've gotten any value from the Seen to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating and review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.